Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday the 8th of September 2021, and in this programme tonight we'll be marking the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I can't believe that 20 years have passed, 2 decades since the world changed on that Tuesday morning on the 11th of September 2001 when 2 passenger planes went into the Twin Towers, and then we also saw another passenger plane go into the Pentagon. And that day, the world changed. So we'll be saying what has changed over the past 20 years as we look back and remember the incredible loss of life that occurred on that day and the lives that were lost in blood in actually fighting the war on terror. Regan, it's great to be doing a live Behind the Headlines with you. It feels like this has been weeks away, so what a very important topic to discuss tonight.
Yeah, it really is. Regular viewers of the programme may remember that last year I brought in some newspapers and magazines. Right after that were released in the week after, that were released the day after. It's still something that is there in the mind. I remember where I was, what I was doing. I was doing some schoolwork actually, and someone called my family and said, you need to turn on the TV. Turn on the TV, and there it was. Thought, oh, it's an accident. And that's how it was at first. One tower, you think, oh, something tragic has happened, they've lost control, there's going to be an investigation. There wasn't the sense of urgency, but then even as we were watching, and even as I'm remembering it now, it's very chilling. There was a plane that we saw as it went into the tower, and that's when everything was, people began to panic, people began to shout, okay, this is not an accident. The United States is under attack. This is a terror attack. We don't know what's going on. We don't know who's responsible. Then there was the report coming of an attack on the Pentagon. And then, of course, who can forget United 93, where a group of very brave passengers, unable to save themselves and the aircraft, crashed the plane, avoiding what it was likely that that plane was headed potentially even to the Capitol.
Or the White House.
Or the White House, exactly. And they brought the plane down in a Pennsylvania field. So it's really hard to believe that was 20 years ago. I still remember it like it was yesterday.
No, absolutely. And, you know, that I think gave me a prophetic wake up that, you know, that we are really in the last days. And it was one of those, not only a decade-defining event, but it was an event that changed the world forever after that. The world wasn't the same. Aviation was never the same again because of all the security taken in place. There was that constant, we had words that we didn't know before, like, you know, jihad and others. So these became in our vocabulary. The world was very, very turbulent after 9/11. Of course, then, you know, we've had the war in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom that was launched by George W. Bush to rid Afghanistan of Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, a couple of years later, we have the war in Iraq. And so it's been a very kind of turbulent last 20 years because of 9/11, and that really triggered the Islamic extremist war against the West. And we saw that build up before, I think, in the 90s. I mean, it really started with the Russians, for example, and their invasion of Afghanistan in '79, but also started with the Islamic Revolution of Iran in '79. And this is when these nations decided to pursue kind of Islamism. And we had the Islamic Revolution in '79. The Saudis then started following their extreme interpretation of Islam, Wahhabism, and started to export that around the world. So this was becoming a big issue. We also had the polarization of the end of the Cold War. So what kept all these smaller nations intact was it was dominated, of course, by 2 big superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, firstly in '89 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the emergence of the Russian Federation of Russia in 1991, you know, all those states that have been part of the Soviet Union gained their independence. And of course, then this opened up this new world of Islamic extremism. We had the Gulf War in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, took an international coalition force. And where were the US, British and other forces that were poised to move Saddam Hussein from Kuwait? In Saudi Arabia. The holiest sites in Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina to Islam, which motivated bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And from there, through the 90s, Al-Qaeda, the Iranians started to develop attacks against the West, in which Clinton turned a blind eye. Even in, I think, 99, had the opportunity to take out bin Laden, but actually decided that he wouldn't actually do it. So, yeah, and then of course we got the horrors of 9/11 that occurred that took the world by surprise. So just to remind you, we are live, we are interactive tonight, and it's great to be live because it's not quite the same when we're not. So the big question for tonight's program is, as we reflect on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, that is this Saturday, our question is, have we forgotten the horrors of 9/11 20 years on?
We cannot forget that since 9/11 has happened, that really kick-started a wave of terror attacks across the world. We've had approaching, I believe, 35 to 40,000 terror attacks that have been recorded since 9/11. It's just an astounding figure. Those are terror attacks directly rooted in Islam. Right, directly related to this belief jihad, that is interpretation out of the Quran, out of the Hadith, that instigates inciting war against those who are infidel.
And it's not an internal struggle, is it? An internal struggle against certain urges that man possesses. This is actual holy war, holy jihad to advance the causes of Islam, to create the Islamic Caliphate, to bring the nations under Sharia law, under an Islamic influence, like what we've seen recently with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Well, consider, Simon, the history of Islam. Consider the spread of Islam and how it conquered vast portions of Northern Africa. I mean, Northern Africa was filled with Bible-believing Christians, has a rich Christian heritage. If you look at countries like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, all these places have a rich Christian heritage. And you don't see that anymore.
Well, look at Turkey.
Yeah,
exactly. You had the
Constantinople.
Constantinople was considered like this was the eastern part of the Roman Empire.
That's right.
When it was divided between the West and the East. So, and that was extremely Christian right up until really the Crusades.
Yeah.
And then everything changed from then.
The goal of Islam is world domination, right? That's the goal of Islam, to have the entire world under the banner of Allah. And if Muslims can bring the entire world under that banner through waging war, then so be it. I think there are some jihadists who would probably say, actually, we don't know if this is the preference. I think they'd much rather people cave and give in to the way of Allah and Sharia law. But because we don't, then there's attack. So you can consider the history of Spain. You can even look at some of the Spanish islands and see how influenced by Islam many of those places were, because of attacks to try to bring Islam in.
Yeah, but there are different factions within Islam.
Oh yeah,
I mean, we've got definitely the Sunnis, we've got the Shiites.
With different motivations
we've got
as well.
The Sufis that are more mystical, a bit more peaceful until they're kind of provoked. So it's a lot more kind of complex than that. It's all tied up with kind of tribes and everything else. But in terms of the view of ISIS, in terms of view of the Iranian regime, in terms of the view of the Taliban, these are the most extreme elements that want to impose their interpretation of Sharia law. They want to set up a global Islamic government run and governed by Islamic principles, and that's what we see with the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's why there is so much discussion about that. But I just want to join back again to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I mean, on that day, we had city workers going to work as normal. I mean, when people talk about Tuesday, the 11th of September 2001, people describe this as being one of the most beautiful days in the whole of the summer. A very crystal clear sky, warm temperature, and then these office workers going in to work in the Twin Towers, the police, the New York Fire Brigade, and others did not have a clue what would happen around 9 o'clock in the morning, US Eastern Standard Time, and to think that there was calm, there was peace, and then sudden destruction fell upon them. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I remember the day, like you say, being crystal clear blue, and you can, obviously I was living in a different part, but across the whole country, really optimal weather conditions, and then suddenly you have this tragedy being broadcast, not just across the United States, but what was particularly unique about it is that I don't think there was a single place in the world with access to television where these images were not relayed throughout the day. People are haunted to this day, especially by some of the intelligence failures that preceded the attacks. So everything's calm, and we go through life like those city workers, and we think, okay, we're just going to go through our life, we're going to do our work, we're going to have our meetings, visit family, friends, do whatever we need to do. We don't always appreciate those emergency personnel and those intelligence personnel who are aware of a lot of stuff going on in the background that threatens our security, maybe nationally, maybe even internationally in various ways. So on this calm day, there would have been people who were aware to a degree that something was fairly imminent, and this is something that we can see that there were some FBI agents who had actually given some warnings that something was amiss. Kenneth Williams, Mark Rossini, and 2 months before the 9/11 attacks, Williams, an agent at the FBI's bureau in Phoenix, wrote what became known as the Phoenix Memo to superiors at FBI headquarters. He had collected intelligence indicating bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were getting ready to do something in relation to civil aviation in the United States, and associates of the terrorist network were attending flight schools in Arizona. And so you kind of think, well, that should raise some red flags. In those days, security in airports was fairly lax. There were far fewer rules, far fewer checks than what we're accustomed to today. And so this gave way for a perfect scenario for the jihadis on those aircraft.
Absolutely, but I think we have to take ourselves back, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the programme, when we're talking about US intelligence failures, we had Clinton come in. America had just won the Cold War. No one was challenging the United States. And we saw that this was a time of peace after that. I mean, the Americans defeated Saddam Hussein and his forces and pushed them out of Kuwait. And there was a sense of growing optimism that there was that famous historian said that this is the end of history. In other words, America's the winner between the two heavyweights, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was then that Clinton decided to not invest in human intelligence, wound down big intelligence operations, didn't rely on human intelligence anymore. At the time of 9/11, the FBI weren't working with the CIA, nor the White House's own national intelligence were actually coordinating anything together. So you had America's huge intelligence agencies, including the Defense Department, that did nothing, was silence. But I think the warnings were coming up, as we saw in, I think it was 1993. There was an Islamist attack on the Twin Towers in 93 that failed. They tried to blow up the Twin Towers. There seemed to be Iranian involvement behind that. And then, of course, we saw a slow escalation in terrorist attacks against US targets. And one big question mark has to be over the TWA flight of 96 that went down off the coast of New York. And there was a lot of discussion then because the Clinton administration would not allow America's aviation authorities to fully investigate why that plane went down. And so there's speculation that this could have been hit by a missile off the coast of New York that brought the plane down. But Clinton didn't want to engage in any wars. He wanted to make sure that he got re-elected. And of course, what we saw after that was the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks in Tunisia and Kenya in 1997 at the US Embassy. And from there, it just escalated. So therefore, you know, Clinton didn't want to engage pretty much in any form of military attack that could affect his chances of re-election or affect his kind of legacy as American president.
Yeah.
And therefore didn't engage. So we were already at war with Al-Qaeda and these Islamic extremist forces.
It's been going on through the 90s.
But what happened then on 9/11 changed everything.
It did. So bringing us up to the day itself, at 8:46 a.m. in New York, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 plowed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, vanishing in a fireball between the 93rd and 99th floors. 17 minutes later, people thinking it's an accident, thinking, okay, we don't really know what's going on. This is obviously tragic. There will be no survivors on that aircraft. What exactly is going on? 17 minutes later, a hijacked United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 aircraft, then took off from Washington's Dulles International Airport, one you're well acquainted with, I think.
Yeah, I know Washington Dulles Airport extremely well.
It was headed for Los Angeles, and it too was hijacked. At 9:37 a.m., the unthinkable almost happened. The aircraft slams into the west wall of the Pentagon, home to the U.S. Department of Defense.
And then we see that United Airlines Flight 93 took off from Newark Airport, International Airport in New Jersey. That morning, its destination was San Francisco. According to a report from the National Transport Safety Board, a team of 4 Al-Qaeda terrorists stormed the cockpit. And at 9:32 a.m., the cockpit voice recorder indicated a struggle was occurring and captured the words of someone yelling, "Get out of here."
Mm. We have an email that asks a question related to what we're talking about. Does what happened on 9/11 get taught about in education in America or Britain? The Second World War is mentioned in our education system, though barely. People ought to be educated about this kind of evil throughout the world. Thank you for what you both do. God bless, Glenda. I don't know. I don't think this is a topic that's very often addressed. It touches on some very sensitive issues. I've spoken with young people who are still in the school system, and I've mentioned 9/11, or I've mentioned the Twin Towers, or I've asked them some questions to try and figure out. And I kind of get the idea that this isn't something that's talked about, perhaps because some of the subject matter around it is very difficult to deal with. There's a lot of issues that some might think, well, okay, we kind of have to deal with Islamic extremism, and some people don't want to go there, some people don't want to talk about that. We then have to consider what's been going on in Afghanistan, particularly in multicultural cities. That can be a very difficult thing to talk about when you have in London some schools. I remember living near a school that had over 200 languages that were spoken by students there. It's just absolutely unreal.
But it's also extraordinary to think that 70 million Americans have been born since 9/11. So they don't actually know what actually happened on September the 11th, 2001, which is absolutely extraordinary. So a whole generation has grown up not knowing anything, well, knowing about 9/11, but not being able to be there and recount what happened or have any memories of it. So it gives you a completely different worldview and perspective. We do have an excellent CBN report to go to now, and this is one woman's story of surviving 9/11.
Outside this apartment building near the Twin Towers, Christina Stanton told how her husband Brian, high up on the 24th floor, shook her awake that 9/11 morning.
He said a bomb went off at the World Trade Center. So we rushed onto our terrace, and we were just in shock.
Then the second plane roared past them to hit the second tower.
And the shock waves from the plane blasting into that building actually blew us back into our apartment.
They rushed out of their building, heading for the southern tip of Manhattan, joining throngs of panicked runners. Christina chronicles it all in Out of the Shadow of 9/11.
Some people were bloodied, other people were in pajamas, just like myself.
She describes how in Battery Park at Manhattan's tip, chaos reigned, especially with the booming sound of the first tower collapsing.
People in Battery Park had a good reason to panic because the Twin Towers were both wider and taller than this present tower, and if they had fallen over rather than collapsed, they could have reached all the way to Battery Park and crushed people by the thousands.
Then choking smoke billowed out from Ground Zero and coated them all in yellow, sticky grime.
Everybody was caught up in the smoke and were, I'm sure, worried they were going to be asphyxiated. Everybody's running around, screeching and bumping into each other and catapulting over things. And I just remember looking at Brian saying, are we going to die?
Quickly hiding behind this War of 1812 fort, the Christian couple said goodbye to each other and began to pray. That's when it hit Christina how shallow her walk with God had been.
Lord, I'm sorry that I have not put you first in my life because I hadn't. He was always, was a Sunday Christian.
All around them, people began screaming at vessels passing by and jumping into the water, and the vessels came.
This ended up being the largest boat evacuation in history. Boats picked up 500,000 people from Manhattan that day.
That included the Stantons, who spent many days with friends before being allowed back into their apartment, where the terrace doors had remained wide open facing Ground Zero.
And it was this huge, full-on trash receptacle. Everything was covered with about 6 inches of yellow dust. There were papers everywhere.
Area residents and workers were told this omnipresent dust was safe, but it turned out to contain some 2,000 toxins.
It was, quote-unquote, toxic soup. There's everything from pulverized concrete to jet fuel to asbestos. There were human remains.
The city rebuilt this area, but Christina and Brian, like many other New Yorkers, were out of work, unsure how to move forward, suffering from that poison and post-traumatic stress.
We ended up going to counseling over it for actually several years.
Yet out of all this darkness around Ground Zero came a guiding light.
The terrorists were shouting God is great as they crashed into the Twin Towers, but what they were really doing was a horrific act for Satan. But still, even in that horror, God was able to bring good.
For the Stantons, having stared death in the face where the towers once stood, they now realized they wanted a real relationship with the God of life and were totally dependent on him for their future. They repented.
I'd let Jesus out of a box on a Sunday, and I'd go back to my life on the weekdays. It was just the realization that I've been living my life really without God.
In her book, Christina tells how God then moved to set their future. It started with Christina reaching out to Reverend Tim Keller's famous Redeemer Presbyterian.
I went to the church, and they covered some bills for us, and we started attending there. Not too long after, I got a job there at the church planting center, and then my husband got a job there.
He's become Redeemer's chief financial officer, while Christina takes mission teams from Redeemer to minister all over the world. They saw and felt suffering during and after the attacks on this ground where the towers fell, and God's not letting that personal experience go to waste.
Our whole lives are changed because of 9/11. It certainly deepened our relationship with Christ. The only thing that matters now is glorifying God and to help others in a hurting world.
Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Ground Zero in New York City.
And, 9/11 had a huge impact on so many Christians, and many of those, like Christina there, who was kind of maybe lukewarm in her faith, really fired her faith up. And that's something that 9/11 did. It made people think so much about the value of life, and particularly for Americans, because, apart from in the Second World War, maybe a few German subs would fire missiles at Miami along the coast, or would attack US shipping. And considering also that Pearl Harbor is so far away from the US mainland, to think that this was a devastating attack on the United States that took the lives of over 3,000 Americans and many other nationals as well, was the biggest and still is the biggest attack on US soil.
Well, the nation was clearly under attack, and the scary thing about it was no one knew, okay, well, where else is this going to come from? Is it going to happen again? Is there a plan? Is there preparation to go after more? You know, initially, George W. Bush was reading a book to school children, and you can see even the recording of that, there's this idea, okay, maybe it's an accident, maybe it's nothing serious, but he's going to need to go and see what's going on at some point. So they made him aware. But then you have, when the second comes in, immediately they realize we're under attack. Bush is eventually moved to a safe place. There's loads of confusion. What was happening, you know, as well with United 93, there was the confusion in the aircraft. The controllers could tell you, get out of here. You read at 41,000 feet, the plane then changes course over northeast Ohio and begins descending as it's headed southeast. The people on board by that point were already aware that there had been, there was something going on.
People must have been messing each other.
They were.
So they probably got a message on board the plane that two planes had gone into the Twin Towers.
That's right.
And you know, terrorists are taking this plane on board. You know, we've got to do something in order to actually stop it from actually attacking the either the White House or the Capitol building, which would have been absolutely devastating if that had actually occurred.
I remember reading an account related to one of the passengers, Todd Beamer,
That's right.
and his wife was relaying some experiences from that day and telephone message he had left her, you know, indicating what was kind of happening and assuring her of his love. And he had, along with others, received text messages saying something's going on here. They saw the activity on the aircraft, and so they believed it was right to intervene. So at least 13 passengers and crew members began calling loved ones on their cell phones and on board GTE airphones, reporting that the flight had been hijacked by 4 men wearing red bandanas and wielding knives. The flight attendant was killed and a passenger had been stabbed. According to the recordings, some of the passengers said they were formulating a plan to fight back. And that passenger, Todd Beamer, was on the phone with a GTE airphone operator who heard him say, "Let's roll," just before the aircraft nosedived over Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and crashed into a field in Shanksville, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, brought down by those very brave passengers who were not going to allow it to fly into another building.
An incredible courage. So they must have known that they were going to die anyway.
Yeah.
So therefore they decided to take destiny in their own hands and to protect America as much as they could. Any more emails before we get to the interview?
We have one here. I would not expect people who witnessed the attack on the World Trade Center on the news media at that time would have forgotten it. As horrific as it was, even some people throwing themselves from the building to escape the fire. What is in store for the world in the not too distant future will be far, far worse. The return of Jesus is fast approaching, and indeed, who can forget that? That's an image engraved in many people's minds of individuals throwing themselves out of the windows. Hi, Simon and Regan. Anita says, it's lovely to have you back. I personally haven't forgotten 9/11 because I was tutoring for a family whose niece was in the Twin Towers. When I arrived, they were waiting to see if she had survived. Thankfully, she got out as she was on a lower level. I remember the awful scenes on TV. I think everyone was in shock. I had the misfortune to have read The Reluctant Fundamentalist. I'm a tutor whose protagonist is a Muslim living in the U.S. He relays the events of that awful day coming on TV and how he smiled. Needless to say, it did raise the subject. I remember the terror attack on London too. I was working in Essex then, and almost everyone had family working in the city. With everything happening in Afghanistan now and the terrorist groups growing stronger, we need to be on the alert. And indeed, we have already heard some warnings that the UK would be even a more likely target than the US because of its proximity and generally closer and easier accessibility for people, terror groups in Afghanistan and elsewhere. This is a question from Dory. Hi guys, do you believe 9/11 was partly an inside job, bearing in mind all the warnings they had and they didn't follow them up? Also the dirty deeds that are being exposed now. No, Dory, personally, Simon may say something otherwise, but I don't believe it was an inside job. I've heard this and looked at some of the claims. I find some of the claims, the inside job idea looks at particular elements, different people saying different parties are guilty. Some of them are blatantly anti-Semitic. It takes the attention off of the evident Islamic jihad that's going on. Some of the stuff is just riddled with anti-Semitism. Other parts of it are just so beyond the pale in regard to reality and how things work that I don't find them plausible. That said, it is inarguable and it's disappointing and grieving that security alerts and warnings were not heeded, and perhaps it could have been prevented, but in God's sovereignty, it was not.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I very much echo what you said, that this is fundamentally a kind of Islamic extremist terrorist attack on the United States soil. There is no doubt that dark forces have used that in order to push through their agenda, no question. But to say that this was an inside job, I find that extremely hard to believe, because if that was the case, you had the Bush administration that were only in power for less than 8 months. How could they organise that and do that? No. Plus also, if this then gets out, no one's going to trust another US government again. So, we had all these equations. So, it's very difficult. There's a lots of question marks still over 9/11 and what happened. There's still classified files that have not been released on 9/11. But to say that, there weren't Islamic terrorists on board those planes that drove into the Twin Towers, it's very, very difficult to say that that didn't actually happen. But also there was a Smithsonian video I saw yesterday on 9/11 in which they're saying that the way that the planes were made with this special metal that's a lightweight metal, which is brilliant for aviation and flying, but when it actually mixes with water, and it would have mixed with the sprinklers when it went into one of the towers, causes massive explosions because of the heat. And then it reacts to the heat, creates many more explosions that could have actually melted the structure of the Twin Towers itself. So lots of question marks over that. But, essentially, this was an Islamist terrorist attack on the United States of America.
And anything else detracts from that reality.
Of course it does. But to blame Mossad or to blame Israel for this is just absolutely disgusting.
And that's what, these are most of the inside job stuff. It's not just putting the blame on Bush for whatever reason. It often goes into, okay, well, was Israel involved? Was Mossad involved? And you look at it and you think, okay, there's no motive even in some of these cases. It can be incredibly far-fetched. And personally, I think it can also be offensive to the survivors. It's extremely offensive.
Those 3,000 people lost their lives and stuff as well. Well, earlier today, I recorded an interview with Edwin Black, who's a New York Times bestseller, and this is his thoughts as we mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We're now joined on Behind the Headlines by Edwin Black, who is a New York Times best-selling author and journalist. Firstly, Edwin, may I say to you and Carol, Shana Tova for the new Jewish New Year.
Thank you very much. And I would say to you and all of your listeners, Gam Lacha, which means we wish the same blessings to you.
Thank you. And we're here to mark the 20th anniversary of those horrendous events that took place 20 years ago in New York City and Washington, D.C., as we saw those two airplanes land straight into the Twin Towers in New York. 20 years on from that awful day, where would you say America is at?
I'm unhappy to say that I think America has made a great deal of progress and then reversed that progress and come back to where it has been. And at no time in the last 20 years have I been more worried about the security of the United States and the world as after what we saw play out in Afghanistan. I think we need greater understanding, we need greater strength, we need greater security, but we also need greater wisdom. And our wisdom was totally lacking when we exited Afghanistan the way we did. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because those guys that we allowed to ascend to power with billions of dollars in weaponry, those guys, we will see them again. We will see them in our squares, and we will see them in our tall buildings. We will, whether that is Union Square in San Francisco, Times Square in New York, or Leicester Square in London, or perhaps Zion Square in Jerusalem. And so I fear for the world, and I hope that all of us can somehow undo the damage that is headed our way from this extraordinary elevation of terrorism in our world.
And Edwin, everyone remembers where they were on 9/11, particularly those also who were alive when JFK was assassinated in November '63. Where were you when 9/11 happened and when we saw that America was under attack?
I was communicating, ironically, with my editors on a different story in Israel, and I'll never forget, and nor will anyone else here, that it was the most beautiful day, the most pleasant day, and suddenly that day became a nightmare for everyone. Everyone went out and got their loved ones, their kids, pulled them out of school, and constantly, wherever you went, people were looking up into the sky, waiting for another attack.
And Edwin, 20 years on from the September the 11th, 2001, we've seen, as you mentioned earlier in this interview, the disastrous US withdrawal of military forces from Afghanistan, leading to the collapse of the Afghan army and Taliban taking complete control over the nation, and particularly also the news that the Iranian regime could only be 70 days away from a nuclear breakout. Do you think the world is now in a more dangerous place, and have we actually lost the war on terror?
Well, Iran is not 70 days away from a nuclear weapon. I would say by this point, they're somewhere between 40 and 50 days away. So I know that action will take place. And when it does, I will be back on your show to explain it. That is coming soon. No one knows the hour or the day. Terrorism is back. We're no longer looking at terrorist gangs and terrorist movements. We are now looking at terrorist armies and terrorist nations. There is a new Mecca for terrorists, and that Mecca is Afghanistan. The Khyber Pass will be a distant blip compared to the weapons market that is already underway. It'll be, there is no possibility that the Taliban are seeking American and British acquiescence for international recognition. They have China, they have Russia, and they have Iran. And all three of those players are in there right now getting trillion-dollar mining operations going and or accelerated. China is thinking about taking over the Bagram airport. Hezbollah will be there. Hamas will be there. Al-Qaeda will be there. And whether ISIS or ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda are adversaries, in many ways, I will use the words of the Taliban themselves, who recently said, the difference between us and Al-Qaeda is the difference between Coke and Pepsi. They know that much about American and British beverages to say that. And so there'll be a proliferation of sophisticated weaponry. We could have left that weaponry in a disabled status. We could have, before we gave it, we could have embedded the kill switches to kill those vehicles, kill those airplanes, kill those helicopters, kill that night vision equipment, kill those biometric devices. We didn't do that. That's naivete, that's ignorance, and the American military, unfortunately, was woke to imaginary social problems and asleep to the real problem of the Taliban taking over in 100 hours, not 100 days.
Edwin, I have to ask you really the big question. The disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan, was this just a total mismanagement of the situation, or we can actually describe it as being absolutely incompetent on behalf of Biden and the State Department? Or was this more sinister, as we found out that, as you mentioned earlier, the Americans left all their military hardware behind? They've given billions of US dollars to the Taliban. Names and lists of American personnel in Afghanistan was left, including Afghans who actually worked with the Americans. So is it more sinister? Was this actually a plan to withdraw from Afghanistan in the way they did and empower the Taliban to take over Afghanistan?
I've heard this allegation from many. I think there's no question it was incompetent. I would say it was criminally incompetent. As to whether it was deliberate or whether it was criminally neglectful, the history books will yet be written, because I don't think that the current president of the United States is actually presiding over his own national destiny. I believe there are other forces at work. Many people believe there are other forces at work. That remains to be seen. We don't want to exaggerate, nor do we want to diminish. I've spent my life being a cynic and a skeptic, and I've been able to prove that throughout history, we have both the perception of history, the perception of reality, and the reaction to that reality, which creates the new reality, tumbling over and over again. We haven't heard the last word, and frankly, we won't have heard the last word for many years. I just hope that when it comes time to assembling the true record of everything that happened and why it happened and the consequences, that we will have the ability to communicate freely.
And Edwin, it was George W. Bush who launched Operation Freedom to actually send in US troops together with British troops and other NATO troops into Afghanistan to ensure that Afghanistan wouldn't be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda to launch terror attacks against the West. And we see now, 20 years on, the Taliban are back in power, back in control of Afghanistan. What does this mean for Israel and America's allies in the Middle East, that they now feel betrayed and feel extremely vulnerable? Even Europeans are now questioning America's commitment to NATO. And as a world superpower, that's a very dangerous place to be in, is it not?
we are going to see repercussions in the very near future in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, in Israel, in Europe, in Central Asia. We're going to see repercussions all over the planet. And I think for our purposes, I can tell you that Hamas and the Taliban at its highest supreme level have already met. They've already self-congratulated each other. An imam at Al-Aqsa, which sits atop the Holy of Holies. That imam has called for the Taliban to liberate the Temple Mount. We know that the Taliban, just in recent days, has reaffirmed that they are an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And just in recent days, they questioned whether Osama bin Laden actually was even involved in 9/11. We have heard the explosion. We have seen the explosion, but we have not measured the fallout. We have not experienced the aftershock. That is the legacy that neither you nor I was expecting to discuss on the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Absolutely. My final question, Edwin, it's incredible to think that 70 million Americans have been born since that fateful day 20 years ago. How do we educate and inform that generation and future generations of the horrors that occurred at 9/11, and also to ensure that the lessons of 9/11 are learnt, because clearly they're not learnt by this Biden administration, who currently hold the keys to the White House?
Well, it's very interesting that you should ask that question, because there is no sense in commemorating without learning about what we are commemorating. To just talk about 9/11 to a generation of Americans that never knew what 9/11 was, just as it is to talk to people about the Holocaust who have no memory of what it is, no knowledge of what it is. This brings to bear our central adversary: lack of knowledge, misinformation, disinformation, low information. You and I both know that knowledge is power, but George Orwell said ignorance is power. And what those who wish us ill want most is to keep us ignorant so that we become powerless. And unless we learn, unless we redouble our efforts to explain, re-explain, and reteach, just as we teach the old teachings, we also have to teach our own history. Unless we do that, then we are doomed to repeat the errors and nightmares of history.
Edwin, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today on this 20th anniversary of 9/11.
And thank you for having me. Bless all of your viewers. And I hope that you and I will be having a cup of coffee one day soon in Great Britain.
Sounds good, my friend. Tidava. Thank you.
Job. I feel sorry for ordinary Muslims who have been duped. We should keep them in our prayers. Here's a recommendation from Joyce. People should read Jonathan Cahn's book, The Harbinger and the Harbinger 2. It explains all of your program. God bless. And you agreed with that. We've had, I believe Jonathan did an interview with this program, or we've shown some of his videos at some point previously, and you've made mention of the Harbinger on
particularly the return that he organised last September, almost a year ago.
Yep. So here we have from Satinder. Good evening, gentlemen. Just joining you after the match, so forgive me if this point has already been made. I'm sure there will be those that will disagree, but I believe 9/11 was an inside job all the way. There are many reasons why, but one being Building 7, as it's known, which collapsed without being hit by anything. The collapse of the buildings was nothing short of controlled demolition. Also, it takes a lot of expertise to fly an airliner, and something that couldn't be picked up with a few flying lessons. Blessings, Satinder. We did address that, Satinder. Both Simon and myself agreed that it's not an inside job.
Yeah, I don't really want to discuss this one because it kind of distracts so much away from the kind of central message that 3,000 Americans and internationals lost their lives on 9/11. And also the other fact is that the war on terror has been going on for 20 years now, and now Biden says, as US president, that he's stopping these never-ending wars because this was the longest military operation in America's history in Afghanistan. Then we saw the absolutely disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that has now left the world in an extremely dangerous place. The Taliban are in power. They are better military equipped than most NATO members, certainly most European countries, because of the American hardware they have. That Afghanistan will again become a safe haven for Islamist terrorists wanting to launch attacks against the West. You also see that the Iranians will be emboldened by this, so will Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS as well. And just when we're on the verge, when it was Trump and the Trump administration gave a deadly knockout blow to ISIS, they'll be back. And it's because of appeasement and its weakness and its failure to understand who the enemy is. And if we're not careful, we are seeing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. However much I love the United States as a country that I do, because it's been a nation of freedom. It's led the world and pushed forth the gospel more than any other country in the world. It's advanced freedom and democracy. But we know that the United States is not mentioned in the end times, and I think what we're seeing now, sadly, is the rapid decline of the United States as a world power. I think we've got about a minute and a half left, Regan.
Yeah, the disastrous withdrawal of the U.S. military has handed victory to Islamists. It has. You've given the breakdown there, but Dora Golds, Israel's former ambassador to the UN, writing in the Jewish News Syndicate, says the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan empowers international terrorism. Military withdrawals only strengthen and motivate jihadists, and that's very definitely the case. President Joe Biden has claimed that al-Qaeda was gone from Afghanistan, but the glaring problem with that claim is that Biden did not have the backing of the American security establishment to even make that claim. An hour after Biden spoke, Defense Department Press Secretary John Kirby says, "We know al-Qaeda is a presence in Afghanistan."
Regan, it's great to be doing this program to mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11 with you. And I want to thank you for watching tonight's program, particularly as we remember what happened over 20 years ago. It's incredible that 2 decades have passed since, but it very much seems that with President Biden and the Democrats in power, that the United States and the Western world has lost the kind of war on terror with devastating consequences. And, it's time that we actually put our trust in God. We don't put our trust in nations. We don't put our trust in military. We don't put our trust in governments, but we put our trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because we know that by faith in Christ, we are strong. And therefore, this is a wonderful opportunity for anyone to reach out to Jesus, because we know that the days are getting darker and darker. So thank you for watching Behind the Headlines.